In February 2022, a quiet neighborhood in Green Bay, Wisconsin became the center of one of the most shocking and disturbing criminal investigations in recent American history. At first, police believed they were responding to a routine welfare check. But what they discovered inside the home would soon turn into a case that stunned investigators, shocked the public, and dominated national headlines. The case revolved around two young people. One of them was a 25-year-old man named Shad Thyrion. The other was a 24-year-old woman named Taylor Schabusiness. What began as a late-night meeting between the two would end in a crime so disturbing that even experienced detectives struggled to process the scene they encountered. To understand how the events unfolded, investigators first looked at the background of the individuals involved. Shad Thyrion lived with his mother in a house located on the west side of Green Bay. Friends described him as a quiet and friendly young man who enjoyed music, spending time with friends, and working on creative projects. He had grown up in the area and was known by many people in the local community. While he sometimes struggled with personal challenges, those who knew him said he was kind-hearted and easy to talk to. Meanwhile, Taylor Schabusiness had also grown up in Wisconsin. Her life, however, had been far more chaotic. Court records later revealed that she had experienced a number of personal struggles over the years. Some of these problems involved substance abuse and legal issues. People who knew her described a life filled with instability and difficult choices. Despite these challenges, few people could have imagined that her name would soon be connected to one of the most shocking crimes in the state's history. On the evening of February 21, 2022, Taylor Schabusiness and Shad Thyrion arranged to meet. According to investigators, the two had known each other previously and had been communicating before the meeting. That night, Taylor traveled to the house where Shad lived with his mother. Inside the house, the two spent time together in the basement area of the home. At the time, Shad's mother was sleeping upstairs and had no idea that anything unusual was happening. According to later statements provided to investigators, the night involved the use of drugs. Authorities would later report that methamphetamine had been used during the encounter. At first, the meeting appeared to be consensual. But at some point during the night, something went terribly wrong. Exactly what happened in the basement during those hours would later become the focus of the criminal investigation. For the moment, the events remained unknown. What investigators would eventually learn, however, would reveal a scene that no one expected. The next morning, on February 22, Shad's mother woke up and noticed that something inside the house seemed unusual. She went downstairs to check on her son. When she entered the basement area, she immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. The room looked disturbed. Furniture had been moved, and there were signs that something violent may have occurred. As she continued looking around the basement, she made a horrifying discovery. What she saw caused her to immediately contact police. When officers arrived at the home, they quickly realized they were dealing with a serious crime scene. Detectives secured the house and began examining the basement area carefully. What they found there shocked even the most experienced investigators. The scene showed clear evidence that a violent crime had taken place. Authorities soon confirmed that Shad Thyrion had been killed. But the disturbing nature of the crime made it clear that this was not a typical homicide case. As investigators processed the scene, they began gathering evidence and speaking with witnesses. Very quickly, one name emerged as the primary suspect: Taylor Schabusiness. Detectives soon learned that she had been the last person known to be with Shad that night. Police immediately began searching for her. But what happened next would make the case even more shocking. Instead of fleeing the area or attempting to hide, Taylor Schabusiness was still in the city. Within hours, police located her and brought her in for questioning. During the interview, investigators expected that she might deny involvement or attempt to explain what had happened. Instead, according to police reports, Taylor began describing the events of the previous night in a way that left detectives stunned. Her statements would soon become a central piece of evidence in the case. Because what she told investigators suggested that the events inside the basement had escalated into an act of extreme violence. And as the interrogation continued, the investigation into the death of Shad Thyrion began revealing details that would soon shock the entire nation. What had happened inside that Green Bay home was far more disturbing than anyone initially imagined. And the full truth about the crime would only emerge as detectives continued examining the evidence and preparing the case for trial. After the discovery of the crime scene inside the Green Bay home, investigators quickly realized that the death of Shad Thyrion was far more disturbing than a typical homicide investigation. What detectives had seen in the basement suggested an act of extreme violence. But the most shocking part of the case was still to come. Soon after officers secured the scene, they began searching for the person who had been with Shad the night before. All evidence pointed toward one individual: Taylor Schabusiness. Police quickly began reviewing phone records and speaking with witnesses to determine where she might have gone after leaving the house. What they discovered surprised them. Taylor had not left the city. In fact, she was still in Green Bay. Officers soon located her at another residence and took her into custody for questioning. When detectives first began the interview, they expected resistance. In many homicide investigations, suspects deny involvement or refuse to speak with police. But according to the official reports later presented in court, Taylor's reaction was very different. During the interrogation, she began describing the events of the previous night. Her statements shocked the investigators in the room. Instead of denying the crime, she reportedly spoke openly about what had happened inside the basement. Detectives carefully documented her statements as the interview continued. According to investigators, Taylor explained that she and Shad had spent the evening together in the basement area of the home. During the night, they had used drugs, including methamphetamine. Authorities later believed that the drugs may have played a role in the chaotic events that followed. As the conversation between Taylor and investigators continued, she began describing how the situation had escalated into violence. According to her statement, the encounter between her and Shad eventually turned into a physical struggle. The details she described indicated that the situation had spiraled far beyond control. Investigators listened carefully as she explained what she claimed had happened during those hours in the basement. The account she provided was disturbing and difficult for detectives to hear. As the interrogation continued, Taylor reportedly spoke in a calm and matter-of-fact tone about the events. For the investigators conducting the interview, the situation was surreal. It was rare for a suspect in such a serious case to describe events so openly. Meanwhile, forensic investigators continued examining the crime scene inside the home. The evidence collected there supported the conclusion that a violent attack had taken place. Investigators photographed the scene, collected physical evidence, and began reconstructing the timeline of the crime. As they processed the basement area, detectives also gathered additional clues that would later become important in the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, news of the investigation began spreading through the local community. Residents of Green Bay were shocked to learn that such a disturbing crime had taken place in their city. Local news stations quickly began reporting on the case. As more details emerged, the story attracted attention far beyond Wisconsin. True crime audiences across the country began following the investigation closely. The unusual circumstances of the case and the disturbing nature of the evidence made it one of the most talked about crimes of the year. Soon after the interrogation, authorities officially charged Taylor Schabusiness with multiple crimes connected to the death of Shad Thyrion. The charges included first-degree intentional homicide. Under Wisconsin law, this charge carries a potential sentence of life in prison. As the case moved forward, prosecutors began preparing the evidence that would later be presented in court. They carefully reviewed the statements Taylor had made during the interrogation. They examined forensic evidence collected from the crime scene. They also interviewed witnesses who had seen Taylor before and after the events of that night. Meanwhile, Taylor Schabusiness was held in custody while awaiting trial. During this time, additional developments in the case continued attracting media attention. One of the most shocking moments occurred during a court hearing in 2023. While appearing in court, Taylor suddenly attacked her own defense attorney. The incident took place in front of the judge and courtroom officials. Security officers quickly intervened and restrained her. The unexpected outburst created even more headlines. For many observers, the courtroom attack raised questions about Taylor's mental state. Her defense team later indicated that they planned to pursue a mental health defense during the trial. They suggested that her behavior might be connected to psychological issues and drug use at the time of the crime. However, prosecutors strongly disagreed with this interpretation. They argued that the evidence showed Taylor had been fully aware of her actions during the incident. According to prosecutors, the statements she made during the interrogation demonstrated that she understood what had happened. As the legal process continued, both sides began preparing for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in Wisconsin. Prosecutors believed they had strong evidence connecting Taylor Schabusiness to the death of Shad Thyrion. The defense team, on the other hand, prepared to argue that her mental state at the time of the crime should be considered by the jury. Meanwhile, the family of Shad Thyrion faced the painful reality of the situation. Friends and relatives described him as a kind and creative young man who had his whole life ahead of him. They struggled to understand how such a violent tragedy could have occurred inside their own home. For them, the upcoming trial represented a search for justice. The courtroom proceedings would eventually reveal the full story of what had happened during the night of February 21, 2022. And the jury would be responsible for determining the fate of the woman accused of committing the crime. But before that verdict could be reached, the trial itself would reveal even more shocking details about the events inside that basement in Green Bay. As the case against Taylor Schabusiness moved toward trial, the investigation into the death of Shad Thyrion continued to reveal disturbing details that shocked both investigators and the public. By the time prosecutors began preparing their case, detectives had already collected a large amount of evidence. This included forensic evidence from the basement of the Green Bay home, statements made by Taylor Schabusiness during police interviews, and testimony from witnesses who had interacted with both individuals before the crime. For the prosecution, the goal was clear. They wanted to show the jury that the crime had been intentional and that Taylor Schabusiness was responsible for the death of Shad Thyrion. But the defense team planned to present a very different argument. They intended to focus on Taylor's mental condition at the time of the incident. According to the defense, the events that occurred that night were strongly connected to drug use and psychological instability. Before the trial officially began, the case had already drawn widespread media attention. True crime audiences across the United States had been following every development. The shocking nature of the investigation, combined with the unusual courtroom incidents involving Taylor Schabusiness, had made the case one of the most talked-about criminal trials of the year. One particularly dramatic moment occurred during a court hearing months before the trial. While appearing before the judge, Taylor suddenly attacked her own defense attorney. The incident happened in front of the entire courtroom. Witnesses reported that she lunged toward the attorney and struck him before security officers intervened. The judge immediately ordered additional restraints to ensure safety during future court appearances. This incident quickly spread across national news outlets. Many observers began questioning Taylor's mental state. Her defense team later used this incident as part of their argument that she may have been experiencing serious psychological issues. But prosecutors argued that the attack was simply another example of unpredictable behavior and did not prove that she was legally insane at the time of the crime. As the trial approached in 2023, both sides began presenting expert testimony regarding Taylor's mental condition. Several mental health professionals evaluated her. Some experts suggested that she had a history of emotional instability and substance abuse. Others concluded that while she may have been under the influence of drugs during the incident, she still understood her actions. Ultimately, the court ruled that Taylor Schabusiness was mentally competent to stand trial. This decision meant the case would move forward before a jury. When the trial finally began in Brown County, Wisconsin, the courtroom was filled with reporters, investigators, and members of the public. Many people wanted to understand how such a shocking crime had occurred. The prosecution began the trial by outlining the timeline of events. They described how Taylor had traveled to the home where Shad Thyrion lived with his mother. They explained that the two had spent time together in the basement during the evening of February 21, 2022. According to prosecutors, drug use played a role in the events of that night. But they argued that the violence that followed was not accidental. Instead, they claimed that Taylor had deliberately attacked Shad during the encounter. Forensic investigators then testified about the evidence discovered inside the basement. They described signs of a violent struggle and the physical evidence collected at the scene. Although some details were too disturbing to be repeated in full during public coverage, the testimony revealed the brutal nature of the attack. Prosecutors also presented evidence from the interrogation that took place after Taylor's arrest. Detectives who conducted the interview testified about the statements she made during questioning. According to investigators, Taylor spoke openly about the events that had taken place. These statements became a critical part of the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, the defense team attempted to present an alternative explanation for the events. They argued that Taylor had been under the influence of methamphetamine at the time. According to the defense, the drug use may have caused a state of psychological confusion and extreme behavior. They suggested that Taylor's actions could not be fully understood without considering the effects of the drugs and her mental health history. To support this argument, the defense called expert witnesses who discussed the psychological effects of methamphetamine. They explained how the drug can cause paranoia, hallucinations, and unpredictable behavior. The defense suggested that Taylor may not have fully understood what she was doing during the incident. But prosecutors challenged this claim. They argued that the evidence showed Taylor had been aware of her actions. They pointed to the statements she made during the interrogation. They also highlighted the sequence of events that occurred after the crime. According to prosecutors, these actions demonstrated awareness rather than confusion. As the trial continued, the jury listened to testimony from multiple witnesses, including investigators, forensic specialists, and mental health experts. Each piece of testimony helped build a clearer picture of what had happened inside the basement that night. Meanwhile, the family of Shad Thyrion attended the court proceedings. For them, the trial was emotionally devastating. They were forced to listen to painful details about the loss of their loved one. Friends and relatives described Shad as a creative and compassionate person who had been loved by many people in his community. They hoped the trial would provide justice and accountability for his death. As the courtroom battle between prosecutors and defense attorneys continued, the case reached its final stage. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury would soon be asked to make a decision. They would determine whether Taylor Schabusiness was guilty of the charges against her. The verdict would decide the future of the woman accused of committing one of the most disturbing crimes in Wisconsin's recent history. And the final chapter of the case would soon unfold inside the courtroom. As the trial of Taylor Schabusiness entered its final phase in 2023, the courtroom in Brown County, Wisconsin became the center of intense attention from media, investigators, and members of the public. For weeks, the jury had listened to testimony about the events surrounding the death of Shad Thyrion. Prosecutors had presented evidence collected from the crime scene, statements made during police interviews, and expert analysis explaining the physical evidence discovered during the investigation. Meanwhile, the defense team had attempted to convince the jury that Taylor's mental state and drug use played a major role in what happened that night. Now, the trial had reached its most important moment. Closing arguments. Prosecutors stood before the jury and carefully summarized the evidence they believed proved Taylor Schabusiness was responsible for the death of Shad Thyrion. They reminded the jury about the timeline of events on February 21, 2022. According to investigators, Taylor had gone to the home where Shad lived with his mother in Green Bay. The two spent time together in the basement area of the house. Later that night, the situation escalated into violence. Prosecutors argued that the physical evidence from the scene clearly showed that a violent attack had occurred. They also reminded the jury about the statements Taylor had made during police interrogation. According to detectives, she had described the events of the night in detail. Prosecutors argued that these statements showed she understood exactly what had happened. They emphasized that her own words supported the evidence collected during the investigation. Next, the prosecution addressed the defense's argument about drugs and mental health. They acknowledged that methamphetamine had been used during the night of the crime. However, prosecutors argued that drug use alone did not excuse the actions that followed. They told the jury that Taylor's behavior before and after the crime demonstrated awareness and control. For example, they pointed out that she had left the house after the incident and continued moving through the city. These actions suggested that she understood what had happened and attempted to continue with her life afterward. After the prosecution finished, the defense team presented their final argument. Their strategy focused heavily on Taylor's psychological condition. Defense attorneys told the jury that the events of that night could not be understood without considering the powerful effects of drugs and mental instability. They described how methamphetamine can cause paranoia, confusion, and extreme emotional reactions. According to the defense, Taylor may have been experiencing a state of psychological breakdown during the incident. They argued that the jury should consider whether she had been capable of fully understanding her actions. The defense also reminded the jury of the courtroom incident months earlier when Taylor had attacked her own attorney. They suggested that this behavior reflected serious mental health problems. In their view, the case was not simply about violence. It was about a person whose life had been affected by addiction, trauma, and instability. After both sides finished their arguments, the judge gave the jury final instructions. The jurors were told that they must carefully evaluate the evidence and determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Then the jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations. For the family of Shad Thyrion, the wait was painful. They had spent more than a year following the investigation and preparing for the trial. Now they waited to learn whether the person accused of killing their loved one would be held responsible. After several hours of discussion, the jury reached a decision. They returned to the courtroom and delivered the verdict. Taylor Schabusiness was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. The verdict confirmed the prosecution's argument that she had deliberately caused the death of Shad Thyrion. Soon after the verdict, the judge prepared to determine the final sentence. Under Wisconsin law, first-degree intentional homicide carries a mandatory life sentence. In September 2023, the judge officially sentenced Taylor Schabusiness to life in prison. During the sentencing hearing, the judge stated that the nature of the crime had been extremely disturbing and that the sentence was necessary to protect the public. For the family of Shad Thyrion, the verdict and sentence provided a measure of justice. However, they also acknowledged that no legal decision could bring back the person they had lost. Friends and relatives described Shad as a creative and kind individual who had a future full of possibilities. His death left a deep impact on those who knew him. The case of Taylor Schabusiness quickly became one of the most widely discussed criminal trials in Wisconsin. It raised questions about the role of drugs, mental health, and violent crime. For investigators, the case was a reminder of how quickly a situation can spiral out of control when substances and unstable circumstances are involved. For the public, the story became another chilling chapter in modern true crime history. And for the family of Shad Thyrion, it remained a tragic loss that would never be forgotten.